Hi guys, so today we are going to be working on Our America and we are on chapter 3. And if you remember on your plans, I've said that you can either follow along with these plans or work at your own pace just because we're doing very large chunks for each day. So if you want to pause the video at any time to take a break and come back to it tomorrow, you certainly can. But we are going to go to chapter 3 now, which is on page 45. I have the teacher edition out, so you're going to see like answer circled and all that stuff, but that's okay. So on chapter 3, you can tell that we're going to be talking about colonial America. And one word that I want you to look for is colony. And I'm going to start reading. Many years had passed since the Pilgrims' first Thanksgiving. More and more people had come from England to live in America. They spread out along the Atlantic coast, living in 13 colonies. A colony is a land that is ruled by another country. Can you guess who ruled the American colonies? England ruled the 13 American colonies at that time. The colonies were the beginning of what would become the United States of America. So a colony is a land that is ruled by another country. And how many colonies did England rule in America? 13. We're going to turn the page. And here at the top we have, I'm going to bring this up just a little bit. Hopefully my thing doesn't fall off. Hopefully my phone doesn't fall off of here. Give me a second here, guys. Sorry. Okay. There we go. Okay. So here's some other words to look for. Colonial, Pennsylvania, and expensive. And a plantation is a large farm in a southern colony. Okay. And if you notice, we see these yellow states, we see these purple, and these orange. And so on our key here, it says the ones that are in yellow are the New England colonies. The ones in purple were the middle colonies, and the orange ones were the southern colonies. Do you see the word colony in colonial? The years that England ruled these 13 colonies in America are called colonial days. A person who lived in the American colonies under the rule of the English was called a colonist. So who is a colonist? A person living in a colony. And over here in colonial life. What kind of houses did people live in during colonial days? That would depend on where they lived. So most of the houses in New England were clapboard houses. That's what they look like. And many colonists in Pennsylvania or New York built log cabins to live in. Can you think of someone who lived in a log cabin? And the first person that comes to my mind is Abraham Lincoln. A colonist living in Maryland might have lived in a stone house. In the southern colonies, some people lived in plantation homes. Why do you think the colonists' homes varied so much from colony to colony? Well, you might say that people used materials that were available to them. They also built homes that were familiar to them, and the colonists had come from different countries in Europe where styles of homes varied from country to country. Let's turn the page. Very few colonists had glass windows in their houses. Glass was very expensive. Instead, they put animal skins or oiled paper over the window openings. The oil made it easier for the sunlight to shine through the paper. And then food the colonists ate. Colonial women did not have many pots or pans. They cooked meat and vegetables together in the same kettle over a big fireplace. Colonists probably had some kind of stew almost every day. Since there were no freezers or canned foods, colonists had other ways of storing food for winter. Foods like corn, beans, and apples could be dried and eaten later. Cornbread and milk could be prepared with the supplies they had. Only supplies like sugar, flour, salt, spices, and tea were bought from a store. Sometimes the men would hunt for food. And some additional information to know about. So most of the colonists' vegetables came from their gardens, their kitchen gardens. They grew plants for medicine and spices as well as vegetables. And besides beef, colonists got milk and butter from their cows. They made cheese from cow's milk or goat's milk. And most colonial women baked their own bread and desserts. Baking was a huge job, and so women would bake just once a week. Why didn't they have refrigerators? Well, there was no electricity, and refrigerators hadn't been invented yet. They didn't have electric or gas stoves, microwaves, dishwashers, blenders, toasters, electric lights, things like that. Over here is an activity that you can try if you want, but it's not required. But it's making an oiled paper window. And let's ask some questions here. I'm going to cover up my answers since I have a teacher edition. What is a land that is ruled by another country? A colony. How many American colonies did England rule? 13. What kinds of food could be bought from a colonial store? You can say things like sugar, flour, salt, spices, tea. And why do you think colonists oiled the paper that they used for windows? To help more light shine through. Okay, we're going to turn the page. So now we're going to be talking about colonial shops. And so one thing I want you to look at is pincers. Pincers. In colonial towns, there were many craft shops where craftsmen worked. Everything was made by hand in these shops. A large town would have many shops. What kinds of shops would you see in a colonial town? So we're going to talk about the silversmith. The first shop we see is the silversmith. A silversmith shop might remind you of a jewelry store. Do you see all the shiny things to buy? A silversmith makes or repairs things using valuable silver, such as buckles, candle holders, earrings, and spoons. Sometimes a silversmith would also be the town watchmaker. So what did the silversmith make his jewelry and other items from? Silver. And who makes the things found in a colonial shop? The shopkeeper. Now we're going to talk about the blacksmith. Down the street, we hear the clang, clang, clang of a hammer against iron. A blacksmith is hard at work here. He makes nails, hinges, farm tools, and horseshoes by hand. First, he softens the black metal or iron in a very hot fire. Then with a heavy hammer, the blacksmith pounds the iron into the shape of what he wants to make. The blacksmith's shop is also the place to go if you needed a dentist in colonial days. At that time, there was only one cure for a toothache: get rid of that tooth. A blacksmith could use his iron pincers to pull out an aching tooth. So what kind of metal did a blacksmith work with? Iron. Why was the blacksmith's shop a hot place to work? The blacksmith's fire had to be very hot to soften the iron. I'm going to turn the page. Now we're going to talk about the joiner. So next we pass the joiner's or cabinet maker's shop. He makes beautiful desks, chairs, tables, and other furniture by hand. Some colonists made their own furniture from rough wood, but families who lived in or near town usually liked to buy beautiful furniture from a skilled cabinet maker. The cobbler. Our next stop is the cobbler shop. We can hear a light tap, tap, tap as we go inside. The cobbler makes of men's shoes. In colonial days, cobblers did not worry about making one shoe for the left foot and another for the right foot. Instead, they made two shoes exactly alike. A left or right foot would fit into either one of them. Do you wish your shoes were like that? I would think that'd be a little uncomfortable. Where do the colonists go to buy a nice desk? The joiner or cabinet maker's shop. Name one way the colonists' shoes were different from our shoes. Well, the shoes were the same for both the right and the left feet. Why do you think cabinet makers were called joiners? Well, they joined together pieces of wood to make furniture. It makes sense. Then over here we see the words apothecary, molasses, pharmacy, which is a place to buy medicine, and barter, trading goods or services instead of using money. So now we're going to read about other shops. There are other shops to see in a colonial town. An apothecary shop sold mixtures of spices and herbs for medicine. Today people would call this kind of store a pharmacy. You could buy barrels from the cooper. Barrels were good for storing food such as fish or molasses. At the whitesmith shop, you could buy things made from tin. Most colonial candle holders, lanterns, cups, and dippers were made of tin. Where did the colonists buy medicine? The apothecary, kind of like our pharmacy. Who made barrels in the colonial town? The cooper. From what metal were most colonial candle holders, lanterns, cups, and dippers made? Tin. All right, let's turn the page. Buying and selling. As you can see, colonial stores were very different from the stores we have now. Today, you cannot see the items being made when you go shopping. Instead, items are mostly made in factories so stores can buy them to sell. Something else was different in colonial towns. Not all of the colonists had money. If they wanted to buy something, they could barter or trade for it. A colonist could bring vegetables to trade with the blacksmith if he needed horseshoes. Perhaps the silversmith needed a new table. He could trade candlesticks for a table from the joiner. So when a colonist needed to buy something, how did he purchase it? He bartered for it. So over here we have this page where you are matching the names of the craftsman with the items that he makes. So I'll take you a second to figure out apothecary, cobbler, silversmith, blacksmith, joiner, and Cooper. Let's see if we're correct. The apothecary, yep, like a pharmacy. Cobbler would be shoes. Silversmith, blacksmith, joiner, and Cooper. All right, turn the page. Did you know? Today we buy sugar in bags, but colonists bought sugar by the loaf. A loaf was a large 8-pound lump of sugar. Colonists could break off a piece if they needed some sugar. Because sugar was very expensive, most people in the North used maple syrup to sweeten food. Guess who taught the colonists how to get maple syrup from the maple trees? The Native Americans. So let's think about it. What kinds of chores might a colonial child have had? Probably cooking and cleaning and probably running to the store to go buy something. Indians taught colonists to make incisions or cuts into the bark of the maple trees, and a spout was inserted into the cut. Sap would trickle out of the bark, run into a spout, and down into the container placed below. Sap was then heated to boiling, which took a long time. Many gallons of sap were needed to make just 1 gallon of maple syrup. So who taught the colonists how to get maple syrup from maple trees? Native Americans. Okay, so now let's answer some questions. Number 1, who owned the colonial pharmacy? The apothecary. Where did a colonist keep his molasses? In a barrel he bought from the cooper. How did a colonist get something he needed without using money? He would barter for it. What did most colonists in the North use to sweeten their food? Maple syrup. All right, then over here we have attend, machine, and schoolmaster. So we're going to be talking about colonial schools. And as you're reading this, I want you to think about the differences between their schools and our school. If a town was large enough, there was a school for children to attend. Some towns were still growing. They did not have a school yet. Learning was very important to colonial families. Many colonial children were taught to read at home. Most colonists were farmers. They did not have machines that farmers have today. When a job had to be done on the farm, the children helped. They did most of their learning during seasons when there was less farm work to be done, which is one reason why we don't have school during the summer. Now, harvest and spring planting were times when colonial children who lived on farms were especially needed to help at home, and because farms were larger and more spread apart in the southern colonies, there were not many schools. Parents in some areas of the South started to get together to hire teachers for their children, and sometimes they would meet in a building in an old field in what was called an old field school. Where did many children who did not have a school to attend learn? At home. There's actually still, here in Nebraska, there's actually still one-room schools that are actually being used, which is pretty cool. All right, we'll turn the page. Remember, there were no cars and buses during the colonial days. How did a child get to school? He walked. Many times, colonial children walked 3 or 4 miles to a schoolhouse. Learning was so important to colonial families that there were 6 school days each week. Even Saturday was a school day. Can you imagine that, on a Saturday going to school? In most colonial schoolhouses, a man called a schoolmaster was the teacher. For a long time, schoolhouses had only one room. No matter, no matter how old they were, all the children were taught in the same room. And just like I said, there are still one-room schools today. In some schools, the children sat on benches instead of at desks. There were a few blackboards and maps. If they did not have paper, students wrote on pieces of bark from birch trees. That would be very difficult. During winter, a fireplace warmed the schoolhouse. Every child took turns bringing firewood from home to school. So instead of taking turns bringing snacks to school, you take turns bringing wood. And that's, if you're wondering how they did one-room schoolhouses, they would have little ones all the way up to high school age children would be all in the same room. So just like I teach first and second grade, a teacher, the schoolmaster, would teach a wide range of ages for that area. So reading was very important to the colonists. They wanted their children to be able to read the Bible. In New England, both girls and boys were taught very basic skills, numbers, alphabet, reading, and writing. In dame schools, D-A-M-E, those are schools where there was a woman teaching a few children in her home. So did colonial schoolhouses have different classrooms for different grades? No, all the children were taught in one room. What would you see in a colonial classroom? You'd see a fireplace, benches, pieces of bark used for paper. So there's something for you to think about. Compare a school with a colonial school. What is the same And what is different? Okay, so now we're going to be talking, did you know, the New England Primer. The first book a colonial child learned to read from was not really a book at all. It was called a hornbook. A thin sheet of paper with a reading lesson written on it was placed on a piece of wood. Over this was placed a thin sheet of animal horn, which you could see through. Small children would hold their horn books and learn the ABCs. The most widely used school book in all of America was the New England Primer. This book taught each letter of the alphabet with a rhyme. Many of these rhymes were about a Bible story. It began A, in Adam's fall we sinned all. And that ended with Z, Zacchaeus, he did climb a tree, his Lord to see. Hornbook contained letters of the alphabet, of course, and many also contained the Lord's Prayer. And to protect the paper, a cow's horn was used. It was first soaked in cold water to separate the horn from the bone. Then it was heated, then pressed flat. The translucent sheet could then be attached to the wooden paddle. For over 150 years, millions of American children learned to read from the New England Primer. After mastering the primer, they would read the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress, which is why in our school, when you get older, you'll also read Pilgrim's Progress. So what was the first book that a colonial child learned to read? A hornbook. What was the most widely used textbook in all of America? The New England Primer. Where did many of the rhymes the New England Primer come from? The stories in the Bible. I'm going to turn the page. So this is something you can try. You can make a horn book if you would like. Obviously not required, but something fun to do. Obviously, you probably can't get a horn from a cow to make it. So this has a more modern day twist to a horn book. And then let's do some questions. What was a colonial school teacher called? A schoolmaster. From what special book did colonial school children first learn to read? A horn book. What book taught the alphabet with rhymes? The New England Primer. How did most colonial school children get to school? They took a bus. Nope, just kidding. They walked. Why did some children learn to read at home instead of going to school? School might have been too expensive, it's too far away from school, and there was farm work to be done. All right, guys, good job.